Welcome back to Review and Facts, and today we are diving deep into one of the most anticipated historical epics of the modern era, Gladiator II. This film is the long-awaited sequel to Ridley Scott's Academy Award-winning masterpiece Gladiator, which was released back in the year 2000 and became an instant classic, redefining the historical action genre for an entire generation of filmmakers and audiences alike. Gladiator II is an American production, made in the United States under the banner of Paramount Pictures, with additional production support from Scott Free Productions, the company founded by the director himself, Ridley Scott. The film was produced by Douglas Wick, Lucy Fisher, Michael Pruss, and David Franzoni, the same Franzoni who helped conceive the original story more than 2 decades earlier. This is a Hollywood production through and through, filmed across multiple international locations including Morocco, Malta, and the United Kingdom, in order to recreate the grandeur and brutality of ancient Rome on a massive cinematic scale. The story of Gladiator II picks up many years after the events of the first film. In the original Gladiator, audiences watched as Maximus Decimus Meridius, a betrayed Roman general turned slave turned gladiator, rose through the ranks of the arena to avenge the murder of his family at the hands of the corrupt Emperor Commodus. Maximus ultimately succeeded in his revenge but died in the process, becoming a legend whose sacrifice was meant to restore Rome to its former glory as a republic governed by the will of the people rather than the whims of a single tyrant. Gladiator II begins roughly 2 decades after that sacrifice, and it becomes painfully clear that Rome did not learn from the lessons of the past. Instead of returning to a just and noble republic, the empire has fallen back into the hands of corrupt and cruel leadership, this time under the joint rule of 2 young and volatile twin emperors named Geta and Caracalla. The film centers on Lucius, a character who was introduced as a child in the very first movie, the nephew of Commodus and the son of Lucilla, sister of the original emperor. Lucius was sent away from Rome as a boy for his own protection, and he has grown into adulthood far from the capital, in the region of Numidia in North Africa, where he has built a quiet life for himself along with a wife. That peaceful life is shattered when Roman forces, led by the general Marcus Ocasius, invade Numidia in the name of imperial conquest. During the brutal siege, Lucius loses his wife and is captured, stripped of his freedom, and sold into slavery just as Maximus once was. He is purchased by a cunning and ambitious former slave-turned-arms dealer named Maximus, who recognizes the fire and skill within Lucius and trains him to become a gladiator, throwing him into the deadly spectacle of the Colosseum. From this point forward, Lucius begins his own journey of vengeance, forced to fight for survival in the arena while secretly harboring a burning desire to bring down the men responsible for the destruction of his home and the death of his wife. As the story unfolds, Lucius discovers the truth of his own royal heritage, learning that he is in fact the last living heir to the legacy of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king whose ideals Maximus once died trying to protect. This revelation forces Lucius to confront not only the corrupt emperors who rule Rome but also his own mother Lucilla, who recognizes him in the arena and is torn between protecting her secret and reclaiming her long-lost son. Meanwhile, Maximus, the man who enslaved Lucius, proves to be far more dangerous than he first appears, revealing his own hidden ambitions to manipulate the political chaos of Rome for his personal gain, using Lucius as a pawn in a much larger game of power. General Ocasius, the very man who conquered Numidia and indirectly caused Lucius's suffering, is also revealed to be a far more complex figure than a simple villain, as he secretly opposes the tyranny of the twin emperors and has been conspiring with Lucilla to restore honorable governance to Rome. As the film builds toward its climax, alliances shift, betrayals are uncovered, and Lucius must decide whether his path forward will be defined purely by vengeance or by the same sense of honor, duty, and strength that once defined Maximus. The final act of the film delivers massive-scale battles and arena spectacles, including naval battles staged inside a flooded Colosseum and dangerous confrontations with wild animals, all building toward a climactic confrontation that determines not only the fate of Lucius but the future direction of the entire Roman Empire. The cast of Gladiator II is stacked with major talent from both Hollywood and international cinema. Leading the film is Paul Mescal in the role of Lucius, the film's central protagonist. Mescal is an Irish actor who rose to international acclaim through his performance in the television adaptation of Normal People, and he further built his reputation with acclaimed performances in films such as After Sun and All of Us Strangers. His casting as the new lead of the Gladiator franchise was seen as a major passing of the torch moment, with Ridley Scott reportedly being deeply impressed by his emotional range and physical transformation for the role. Standing opposite him is the legendary Denzel Washington, who portrays Maximus, the cunning former slave-turned-power broker. Washington is one of the most respected and decorated actors in the history of American cinema, with multiple Academy Award wins and a career spanning powerful performances in films such as Training Day, Glory, American Gangster, and Fences. His performance as Maximus has been widely praised as one of the highlights of the entire film, bringing a magnetic and unpredictable energy to the character. Pedro Pascal takes on the role of General Marcus Ocasius, the Roman military leader whose actions set the story in motion. Pascal has become one of the most in-demand actors in the industry in recent years, known for his work in The Mandalorian and The Last of Us, and his performance in Gladiator II adds emotional depth to a character who could have easily been a simple antagonist. Connie Nielsen reprises her role as Lucilla from the original film, bringing continuity and emotional weight to the sequel as a mother forced to navigate impossible political and personal circumstances. Joseph Quinn, known for his breakout role in Stranger Things, appears as one of the twin emperors, Geta, while Fred Heckinger portrays the other twin emperor, Caracalla, with both actors delivering deliberately unhinged and theatrical performances meant to reflect the decay of imperial leadership. The supporting cast also includes May Calamoy, who underwent an extensive audition process personally overseen by Ridley Scott due to the importance of her role within the story. In terms of release information, Gladiator II had its world premiere in Sydney, Australia on the 30th of October in the year 2024. It then opened in the United Kingdom on the 15th of November, followed by its wide release in the United States on the 22nd of November of that same year. The film later became available for digital download in December of that year, followed by physical media releases on Blu-ray and Ultra HD Blu-ray in the early months of the following year. The marketing campaign for the film built tremendous anticipation, with the first official trailer dropping in July and immediately going viral due to its jaw-dropping visuals, including a fierce one-on-one sword duel between the characters played by Paul Mescal and Pedro Pascal, as well as a stunning sequence showing sharks unleashed inside a flooded Colosseum arena. A second trailer followed in September, further emphasizing the film's themes of vengeance and highlighting additional action sequences, including a now-famous battle involving a heavily armored rhinoceros charging through the arena, a sequence which director Ridley Scott has stated he wanted to include in a Gladiator film for over 20 years. The film carries an R rating due to its intense and bloody violence, staying true to the brutal tone established by the original movie, and it was produced on a massive budget in order to recreate the scale and spectacle of ancient Rome with a combination of practical sets, real locations, and modern visual effects. Gladiator II ultimately stands as an ambitious continuation of one of cinema's most celebrated historical epics, attempting to explore themes of legacy, corruption, vengeance, and the cyclical nature of power within the Roman Empire. While critical reception was generally positive, many reviewers and audiences noted that the film struggles to fully capture the emotional depth and narrative tightness of its predecessor, with some feeling that the story leans more heavily into spectacle than the character-driven storytelling that made the original so iconic. Even so, the performances, particularly from Denzel Washington and Pedro Pascal, along with the sheer scale of the production, have made Gladiator II a significant cinematic event and a worthy, if imperfect, successor to a legendary film. It stands as a reminder of how power can corrupt even the noblest of intentions, and how the fight for honor often comes at the highest possible cost. Gladiator II, the complete story retelling. The sun rose over the coast of Numidia the way it had risen every morning for as long as Lucius could remember, spilling gold across the water and turning the white walls of the town into something that almost looked untouched by the weight of history. For years this had been his world, a quiet province on the edge of the known earth, far removed from the marble palaces and screaming crowds of Rome. He had built a life here, a life he had chosen for himself rather than one that had been handed to him by blood or birthright. He had a wife whose laughter filled the small rooms of their home, he had friends among the soldiers and farmers of the town, and he had, more than anything else, peace. It was a peace he had fought hard to construct out of the wreckage of a childhood that had ended far too soon, a childhood spent in the shadow of an empire that had already tried once to erase him from its story. He did not speak of Rome. He did not speak of the mother who had sent him away as a boy, tears in her eyes, wrapping him in a cloak far too heavy for the heat of the ships that would carry him across the sea to safety. He did not speak of the uncle whose madness had nearly consumed the empire, nor of the general whose death in a dust-filled arena had somehow, impossibly, changed the course of history for a brief and shining moment before the world snapped back into its old and familiar shape. Numidia had given him the gift of forgetting, or at least the illusion of it, and he had wrapped himself in that illusion the way a man wraps himself in a blanket against the cold he knows is still waiting for him outside. In the years before the invasion, Lucius had carved out a life for himself that bore almost no resemblance to the gilded existence he had been born into as a child of the imperial family. He rose before dawn to walk the shoreline with his wife, learning the rhythms of a fishing town that measured its wealth not in gold or conquest but in the steadiness of the tides and the health of its people. He had taken up the trade of a soldier of the local garrison, not out of any desire for glory but because a man of his strength and discipline was needed to help protect the town from raiders and from the occasional skirmishes that flared along the desert frontier. He had earned the respect of the people around him slowly, through consistency rather than charisma, through the simple accumulation of small kindnesses and quiet reliability that eventually convinces a community that a stranger has become one of their own. He had never told anyone, not even his wife in the earliest days of their marriage, the full truth of where he had come from or what his birth name had once been. He had simply become a new man in Numidia, a man whose name carried none of the weight of Rome or the blood-soaked history of the family he had. His wife, a woman whose strength matched his own in every way that mattered, had never pressed him for the details of his past, sensing instead that whatever burdens he carried were his to share only when he was ready. She had built a home with him from nothing, planting a small garden behind their house, raising goats along the hillside, and filling the evenings with music and laughter that had, for a time, convinced Lucius that perhaps the wounds of his childhood could finally begin to heal. It was this fragile and hard-won happiness, more than anything else, that made the arrival of the Roman ships on the horizon feel like such an unbearable betrayal, not merely of his safety but of the very possibility that a man could ever truly escape the empire. But peace, as history has always shown, is a fragile thing, especially in ages ruled by ambition. On the horizon, sails began to appear, dark shapes against the golden morning, moving with the terrible discipline of a force that did not sail without purpose. Rome had come to Numidia, not as a friend, not as a trading partner, but as a conqueror. The empire under its twin emperors had turned its hungry eyes toward the edges of its dominion, seeking new lands to add to its ledgers and new glories to parade through the streets of the capital. Leading this invasion was a general named Marcus Ocasius, a man whose reputation for military brilliance was matched only by the quiet weariness that had settled into his eyes after years of fighting wars he no longer believed in. He was a soldier who had given his life to Rome, who had bled for it more times than he could count, and yet who harbored within himself a growing horror at what Rome had become under the rule of Geta and Caracalla, two young emperors more interested in spectacle and cruelty than in the well-being of the people they claimed to serve. Acacius led his legions onto the shores of Numidia with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before, and the town that Lucius called home became a battlefield within hours. The fighting was brutal and swift, Roman discipline crushing the defenders who tried desperately to hold their ground. Lucius fought alongside his people, wielding a blade with a skill that betrayed a training far more formal than anything a simple farmer or tradesman would have received, though in the chaos of battle no one paused to wonder where such skill had come from. He fought not for glory, not for conquest, but for the one thing that mattered more to him than his own life, the woman who stood beside him, his wife, who refused to flee even as the walls of their home began to burn around them. The Roman siege engines arrived first, massive constructions of wood and iron that battered against the modest fortifications of the town with a relentlessness that spoke to the sheer scale of resources Rome was willing to commit to even a relatively minor territorial conquest. Fire followed soon after, catapulted over the walls and clay vessels that shattered on impact and sent burning oil spilling across rooftops and market stalls alike. The defenders of Numidia, though brave and disciplined in their own right, were simply outmatched, their numbers a fraction of the legions arrayed against them, their weapons and armor decades behind the standardized equipment carried by Acacius's soldiers. Lucius fought at the front of what defense could be mustered, his blade finding its mark again and again, buying precious minutes for families to flee toward the hills beyond the town, minutes that felt like hours in the chaos and smoke of the collapsing settlement. He returned to find his own home already surrounded, Roman soldiers moving through the streets with the methodical thoroughness of men executing a plan rather than men engaged in the wild chaos of open battle. His wife had refused every earlier suggestion that she flee ahead of him toward the caves in the hills where the town's elders had once told stories of families surviving raids in generations past. She had insisted on staying near him, on fighting beside him if it came to that, and it was this fierce, uncompromising loyalty that had drawn him to her in the first place, the same loyalty that now placed her directly in the path of the advancing legion. The battle turned against Numidia as it always turns against the smaller and less prepared force when faced with the full weight of an empire's war machine. Lucius watched as his wife fell, an arrow finding her in the chaos of the retreat, and something inside him broke in a way that would never fully heal. He knelt beside her in the burning wreckage of the street they had walked together so many mornings before, and in that single unbearable moment, the man who had spent years building a quiet, anonymous life ceased to exist, replaced by something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. He was captured shortly after, dragged from the wreckage of the only life he had ever chosen for himself, thrown into chains alongside the other survivors of the siege, his rage burning so hot within him that even the Roman soldiers who guarded him seemed to sense they were transporting something far more dangerous than an ordinary captive. The ships that carried the prisoners back toward the heart of the empire were floating tombs of grief and fury, packed with men and women who had lost everything in a single morning. Lucius sat among them in silence, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the horizon, replaying the moment of his wife's death over and over until it had carved itself permanently into the architecture of his mind. He did not weep, not where others could see him. He simply waited, the way a blade waits in its sheath, patient and cold, for the moment it will finally be drawn. The journey across the sea lasted many days, days measured in the creak of timber, the rationed distribution of water, and the low murmur of prisoners exchanging fragments of their former lives in the darkness below decks. Some among the captives had been farmers, others fishermen, a few had been minor officials of the Numidian settlement who had never lifted a weapon in their lives until the morning the Roman legions arrived. Lucius spoke to almost none of them, retreating instead into a silence so complete that even the guards assigned to watch the prisoners began to give him a wide berth, sensing in his stillness something far more unsettling than the open despair or anger displayed by the others. He spent those long days replaying every choice that had led him to this moment, wondering whether a different decision, a different word spoken in the chaos of the siege, might have spared his wife the arrow that found her, knowing even as he turned the question over and over that no answer would ever bring her back. Rome, when it finally came into view, was nothing like the city he remembered from his childhood, and yet it was exactly the same in all the ways that mattered most. The marble had not lost its shine, the crowds had not lost their appetite for spectacle, and the games in the great Colosseum had not lost their power to summon tens of thousands of citizens eager to watch other human beings fight and die for their entertainment. It was into this world, this machine of blood and applause, that Lucius was delivered, sold like cattle in the slave markets that operated in the shadow of the very monuments built to celebrate Roman glory. He was purchased by a man named Maximus, a figure whose presence seemed to bend the room around him the moment he entered it. Maximus had once been a slave himself, taken from his homeland in circumstances not unlike those Lucius now found himself in, and through decades of cunning, ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural understanding of how power actually functioned beneath the surface of Roman politics, he had transformed himself into one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the city. He dealt in weapons, in armor, in the machinery of war, and above all he dealt in gladiators, maintaining a stable of fighters whose victories in the arena only added to his growing fortune and his growing influence among the elite of Rome. Maximus did not see Lucius as merely another body to throw into the sand. He saw something else entirely, a fire behind the eyes, a controlled fury that reminded him, perhaps, of something he recognized in himself from many years before. Maximus himself had walked a path not entirely unlike the one Lucius now found himself forced onto, though separated by decades and by the particular cruelties of a different chapter in Rome's long history of exploitation. Taken from his homeland as a young man, sold from owner to owner, forced to fight and to endure indignities that would have broken lesser men, Maximus had discovered within himself an unusual gift, not merely for combat but for reading the ambitions and weaknesses of the people around him. He had used that gift to claw his way free of slavery, to build alliances with merchants and soldiers who recognized his usefulness, and eventually to construct an empire of his own within the empire, a network of trade, weaponry, and gladiatorial talent that made him indispensable to the very system that had once sought to crush him entirely. There was, beneath his charm and his theatrical flourishes, a deep and abiding hatred for the aristocracy of Rome, a hatred he had learned to disguise behind smiles and favors and carefully calculated generosity, waiting patiently for the moment when the empire's own excesses might finally offer him an opening to claim something greater than mere wealth. He began to train Lucius, not out of kindness, for kindness was a currency Maximus rarely spent, but out of calculation. A fighter with genuine rage, genuine skill, and a story that could capture the imagination of the Roman crowd was worth more to him than gold. He studied Lucius in those early days the way a merchant studies a rare and valuable commodity, noting the precision in his footwork, the discipline in his breathing even in moments of extreme exhaustion, the way his eyes calculated distance and timing with an instinct that spoke of formal training rather than mere survival instinct. Maximus began to suspect, long before he had any proof, that the man he had purchased in the slave markets was no ordinary Numidian farmer or soldier, and he filed this suspicion away carefully, understanding that such information, Lucius resisted at first, his grief still too raw, his hatred for Rome and everything it represented burning too fiercely for him to see any path forward beyond simple survival. He refused to eat properly in the early weeks of his captivity, refused to engage with the other fighters training alongside him, and on more than one occasion had to be physically restrained from attacking his captors in outbursts of grief-driven fury that would have ended in his execution had Maximus not intervened, recognizing the value of the raw material even in its most volatile state. But survival, he came to understand, required strength, and strength required purpose, and slowly, painfully, he allowed the fire within him to be shaped into something he could wield rather than something that would simply consume him. He trained through the heat of the afternoons and the cold of the desert nights, learning the particular rhythms and rules of arena combat, a different discipline entirely from the battlefield fighting he had known in Numidia, one that rewarded showmanship and controlled aggression as much as raw survival instinct. His first fights in the smaller arenas beneath the shadow of the Colosseum were brutal introductions to the reality of his new existence. He fought men who had spent years honing their craft in the sand, men who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove, and he won not through joy or ambition but through sheer necessity, the simple animal calculation that death was not yet an option he was willing to accept. Word began to spread through the underground fighting circuits of Rome about a new gladiator, a man with unusual skill and an even more unusual intensity, someone whose fights drew crowds simply through the promise of violence delivered with an almost frightening precision. Each victory in these smaller arenas came at a cost that extended beyond the physical wounds he carried away from every match. Lucius began to notice the way the crowds responded to violence, the way ordinary citizens, merchants, mothers, and children alike, cheered with genuine delight at the suffering of men who, only weeks before, had been farmers or soldiers or fathers in towns not unlike the one he had lost. It disturbed him deeply, this appetite for cruelty dressed up as entertainment, and it hardened within him a growing contempt for the Rome that had raised such appetites in its people, even as he understood that his own survival now depended on feeding that same appetite match after match. He began to study his opponents not merely as threats to be neutralized but as fellow prisoners of the same brutal system, men whose deaths brought him no satisfaction even when necessity demanded he be the one to deliver the final blow. It was not long before Lucius's growing reputation drew him into the heart of the empire's grandest and most dangerous stage, the Colosseum itself, where the twin emperors Geta and Caracalla ruled over the games with the same erratic and often cruel unpredictability with which they ruled over the empire beyond its walls. The two brothers had inherited the throne through the tangled and often bloody lineage of Roman succession, and they wore their power the way spoiled children wear stolen crowns, delighting in excess, in spectacle, and in the theater of dominance that the games provided them. Under their rule, the Colosseum had become even more extravagant and even more deadly than it had been in the years of Commodus, with elaborate and often absurd innovations designed purely to shock and entertain the masses, including the transformation of the arena floor into a flooded battlefield capable of hosting naval reenactments, complete with real ships, real soldiers, and, on more than one horrifying occasion, it was into this flooded arena that Lucius was thrown for one of his most dangerous early battles, forced to fight for his life aboard a wooden vessel, while the crowd roared above him and predators circled beneath the surface of the water. He survived, as he always seemed to, drawing on a combination of skill, desperation, and a growing, almost frightening command of the chaos around him. Each victory added to his legend, and each victory brought him one step closer to a confrontation he did not yet know was coming, a confrontation with the very general whose invasion of Numidia had set this entire chain of events into motion. Geta and Caracalla ruled Rome with an unpredictability that kept the entire imperial court in a perpetual state of anxious vigilance. The two brothers had grown up amid the paranoia and excess of a court that rewarded flattery over competence, and their rule reflected every flaw such an upbringing might be expected to produce. They quarreled constantly, sometimes over matters of genuine policy but more often over petty jealousies and imagined slights, their arguments frequently spilling out into public displays that left courtiers and senators alike uncertain which brother truly held the greater share of power at any given moment. They surrounded themselves with advisers who told them only what they wished to hear, and they poured the treasury's resources into ever more elaborate spectacles for the Colosseum, viewing the adoration of the crowd as a more reliable currency of legitimacy than any actual accomplishment of governance. It was precisely this obsession with spectacle that had created the opening Maximus so skillfully exploited, for a court more interested in the next elaborate games than in the mundane business of running an empire was a court ripe for manipulation by anyone patient and clever enough to understand its weaknesses. Marcus Acacius, though celebrated publicly as one of Rome's greatest military heroes, had grown increasingly disillusioned with the emperors he served. He had seen too much cruelty, too much waste, too much of the empire's strength being poured into spectacle rather than governance, and he had begun, quietly and carefully, to conspire with a woman who understood the machinery of Roman power perhaps better than anyone else alive. That woman was Lucilla, daughter of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, sister of the long-dead tyrant Commodus, and though very few in Rome knew it, mother to a son she had been forced to send away many years before in order to save his life. Lucilla had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of imperial politics, surviving through a combination of intelligence, patience, and a willingness to make impossible compromises, all while nursing a quiet hope that one day the empire her father had built might be restored to something resembling justice. Lucilla had spent the years since the fall of Commodus watching successive rulers squander the fragile stability that had briefly been restored to Rome in the aftermath of Maximus's sacrifice. She had married and buried more than one husband in the intervening decades, each union a calculated maneuver within the treacherous currents of imperial succession rather than any true expression of affection, and she had learned to mask her private convictions behind a public face of dutiful compliance, a mask she had perfected out of necessity long before Geta and Caracalla ever ascended to their shared throne. Beneath that mask, however, burned a determination inherited directly from her father, a belief that the ideals of the old republic, ideals of justice, restraint, and service to the people rather than to personal glory, were worth preserving even at tremendous personal risk. Acacius and Lucilla had become allies bound not merely by political ambition but by something closer to love, a bond forged through years of shared frustration with the emperors they were sworn to serve and shared belief that Rome deserved better than the men currently sitting upon its throne. Their relationship had grown slowly and carefully across years of stolen conversations and coded messages. Two people who understood all too well the price of discovery, and who had nonetheless chosen to risk everything for both each other and for the larger cause they had come to share. Together they began laying the groundwork for a conspiracy, one that would require careful timing, the loyalty of key military units, and a spark, some catalyst that could ignite the change they both believed was necessary. Neither of them yet understood that the spark they were waiting for was fighting for his life in the sand of the arena, close enough that Lucilla might have passed within feet of him without knowing that the ferocious gladiator gaining fame throughout the city was, in fact, the son she had spent 2 decades believing she might never see again. The moment of recognition, when it finally came, arrived not through some grand revelation but through something far more human and far more devastating, a glance across a crowded arena, a detail in the way Lucius moved or fought that stirred something in Lucilla's memory she could not immediately explain. She began to watch him more closely, first with curiosity, then with a mounting and almost unbearable suspicion, until finally she could no longer deny what her heart already seemed to know. The gladiator known throughout Rome for his brutal efficiency and his barely restrained fury was her son, grown into a man forged by loss and violence, standing in the very arena that had once claimed the life of the man who had died trying to protect the ideals her father had believed in. For Lucilla, this discovery was a wound layered over decades of older wounds, forcing her to confront the reality that her decision to send Lucius away, though made to save his life, had also condemned him to a childhood without her, a childhood that had eventually led him into slavery and now into the deadly theater of the games. She could not reveal herself to him immediately, not without risking both their lives, for Rome under Geta and Caracalla was a place where even the smallest hint of royal lineage outside the official bloodline could be treated as a threat to be eliminated. She was forced to watch him fight, to watch him bleed, to watch him come closer to death with each passing match, all while maintaining the careful political mask she had worn for most of her adult life. Lucius, for his part, remained unaware of his true heritage for a significant portion of this unfolding drama, focused instead on the more immediate and consuming task of survival, and on a slowly hardening resolve to find and destroy the man responsible for the death of his wife, General Marcus Acacius. He did not yet know that Acacius was secretly working against the very emperors he served, nor did he know that the general's growing disillusionment with Rome mirrored his own. All Lucius knew was the image of his wife falling in the chaos of the Numidian invasion, and all he wanted, in the depths of his grief, was the chance to look the man responsible in the eyes before ending his life in the sand of the arena where so many others had already met their end. Maximus, watching all of this unfold with the patient calculation of a master strategist, began to see opportunities within opportunities. He recognized Lucius's hidden fury toward Cassius and understood instinctively how valuable such a rivalry could be, both as entertainment for the crowds and as a tool for his own political ambitions. Maximus had never been content to remain merely a supplier of gladiators and weapons. Beneath his charming and often theatrical exterior lay a man who had spent decades studying the mechanisms of Roman power, waiting patiently for the moment when the chaos of the empire might finally offer him a path toward influence far greater than anything a former slave should have been able to achieve. He began maneuvering behind the scenes, feeding the emperor's information, staging matches designed to inflame tensions, and positioning himself as an indispensable advisor to men who were, in truth, far too foolish and far too self-absorbed to recognize the danger growing in their midst. As the political tension in Rome deepened, so too did the physical danger faced by Lucius within the arena. The emperors, always hungry for new spectacle, began designing increasingly elaborate and lethal contests, drawing on the full theatrical resources of the empire to keep the citizens entertained and distracted from the growing unrest simmering beneath the surface of daily Roman life. One of the most infamous of these spectacles involved the release of a heavily armored rhinoceros into the arena, a beast trained and outfitted for combat, forcing Lucius and his fellow gladiators to fight not only each other but a creature of terrifying size and power. The beast had been outfitted with plated armor along its flanks and head, transforming it into something closer to a living siege engine than a mere animal, and its handlers, positioned safely beyond the arena walls, directed its fury toward the terrified fighters below through a combination of prods, scent lures, and the sheer chaotic noise of the crowd itself. Lucius watched two of his fellow gladiators crushed beneath its charge within the opening moments of the contest, their screams swallowed almost instantly by the roar of tens of thousands of spectators who seemed to find the brutality of the spectacle more thrilling with every fresh casualty. He survived that day through a combination of careful positioning, an intimate understanding of the arena's terrain gained through weeks of prior combat, and a willingness to use the chaos of the crowd's own noise as cover for movements the beast's handlers could not easily anticipate. The sequence became one of the most visually stunning and dangerous moments of his growing career as a fighter, a battle that tested every ounce of skill and instinct he had developed since his capture, and one that further cemented his status as the most celebrated gladiator in Rome, his name now spoken in taverns and marketplaces across the city with a mixture of awe and morbid fascination. It was in the midst of this escalating cycle of violence and political maneuvering that Lucius finally learned the truth of his own identity. The revelation came through a combination of Lucilla's careful, anguished attempts to reach him and through fragments of his own suppressed memory finally rising back to the surface after years of deliberate forgetting. He learned that he was not merely a nameless slave turned gladiator but the last living descendant of Marcus Aurelius, heir to a legacy that had once represented the highest ideals of Roman governance before it had been corrupted and nearly destroyed by the very family into which he had been born. The knowledge struck him with the force of an earthquake, unsettling every assumption he had made about his own life and forcing him to reconsider not only his relationship with his mother, but his understanding of his own purpose within the chaos of Roman politics. The moment Lucilla finally found the opportunity to speak with him privately, away from the watchful eyes of guards and courtiers, was one neither of them would ever forget. She had rehearsed the words for years, imagining a reunion that might one day come under safer circumstances, yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality of standing before a son grown into a hardened stranger, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has survived more grief than any single life should reasonably contain. She spoke of the night she had sent him away, of the ship that had carried him from her arms toward a future she could not control, of the years spent wondering whether her decision had saved his life or merely delayed a different kind of ruin. Lucius listened in a silence that felt, to Lucilla, more painful than any accusation. This revelation did not soften his fury, at least not immediately. If anything, it complicated it, layering the personal grief of losing his wife with the much larger and more ancient grief of a family torn apart by ambition and betrayal. He found himself caught between the desire for simple, personal vengeance against Acacius and a growing awareness that the forces shaping his life were part of something far larger, a struggle for the soul of Rome itself that had already claimed the life of Maximus decades before and now threatened to claim his own. Lucilla, desperate to protect her son and equally desperate to see her long-planned rebellion against the emperor succeed, began working more urgently to bring the various threads of the conspiracy together. She revealed the truth of Acacius's growing opposition to Geta and Caracalla, forcing Lucius to confront the possibility that the man he blamed for his wife's death might, in fact, be a potential ally in the larger fight against the corruption consuming the empire. This revelation did not erase Lucius's anger, for grief does not simply dissolve in the face of political convenience, but it did force him to begin questioning the simple narrative of vengeance he had constructed for himself since his capture. Meanwhile, Macrinus continued his own quiet campaign for power, growing increasingly bold in his manipulations of the emperors and increasingly confident in his ability to shape the outcome of the brewing conflict to his own advantage. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the story, that Rome in this era was a city built on spectacle, and that whoever controlled the narrative of the arena controlled, in some very real sense, the loyalty of the people. He began orchestrating events designed to bring Lucius, Acacius, and the emperors into direct and explosive confrontation, calculating that whatever chaos emerged from that collision could be exploited to further his own rise toward the throne itself, a throne he believed, given his own remarkable journey from slavery to wealth, he was entitled to claim. The political situation in Rome grew increasingly volatile as whispers of conspiracy began to spread through the city, reaching the paranoid ears of Geta and Caracalla, who responded with the erratic cruelty that had come to define their reign. Suspected conspirators were rounded up, executions became more frequent, and the atmosphere within the capital grew thick with fear and uncertainty. Acacius, aware that his secret alliance with Lucilla was in growing danger of exposure, began accelerating his plans, understanding that any delay could mean death not only for himself but for everyone connected to the rebellion he had helped orchestrate. The breaking point arrived when the conspiracy was finally discovered, whether through betrayal, carelessness, or the calculated maneuvering of Macrinus himself remains a matter of brutal irony, given how much Macrinus had benefited from the chaos surrounding the plot without ever fully committing his own loyalty to either side. Acacius was arrested, his years of loyal service to Rome offering him no protection against the wrath of emperors who saw conspiracy everywhere they looked. Lucilla, too, found herself in mortal danger, her royal blood offering diminishing protection as the emperor's paranoia reached new and dangerous heights. Lucius, upon learning of Acacius's capture and imminent execution, found himself facing an impossible choice. The man he had once blamed entirely for the destruction of his life in Numidia was now revealed to be someone fighting, in his own flawed and complicated way, for many of the same ideals that had once driven Maximus to sacrifice everything in that same arena decades before. Whatever anger remained in Lucius's heart was forced to confront a larger truth, that the real enemy was not one general following the orders of a corrupt empire but the corruption itself, embodied in the persons of Geta and Caracalla, and increasingly, in the shadow of Macrinus, whose ambitions had grown far beyond anything the emperors themselves could have imagined. The final confrontation began to take shape within the walls of the Colosseum itself, the same arena that had witnessed the death of Maximus, the rise of Lucius as a gladiator, and now, the culmination of a conspiracy that had been building for years beneath the surface of Roman politics. Acacius, condemned to die publicly as an example to any who might consider opposing the emperors, was brought into the arena to face what was intended to be a humiliating and fatal spectacle. Lucius, forced to participate in this execution as one of the gladiators tasked with carrying out the emperor's judgment, found himself standing at the crossroads of his entire journey, torn between the vengeance he had once sworn and the larger truth he had come to understand about the nature of the empire he had been born into. In a moment that echoed the defiance of Maximus decades before, Lucius chose not to become an instrument of the emperor's cruelty. Instead, he turned against the very system that had enslaved him, sparking a chaotic and bloody uprising within the arena itself as gladiators, soldiers loyal to the conspiracy, and ordinary citizens caught up in the fervor of the moment clashed against the forces still loyal to Geta and Caracalla. In the days leading up to the final collapse of the emperor's rule, Maximus had grown bolder in the imperial court than any freed slave in living memory, ingratiating himself so thoroughly with Geta and Caracalla that he had become something close to a shadow regent, whispering counsel into ears too foolish to recognize the danger of the advice they were receiving. He encouraged the brothers' worst instincts, urging them toward greater extravagance, greater cruelty, and greater paranoia, understanding that a court consumed by internal suspicion would be far easier to topple than one that maintained even the thinnest thread of unity. He funded lavish games specifically to distract the population from the growing unrest, while simultaneously funneling resources toward the very soldiers and gladiators he suspected might one day be called upon to fight in a conflict of his own making. Maximus, watching this chaos unfold, made his own final and most audacious move, seeking to use the collapse of the emperor's authority as an opportunity to seize power for himself, positioning himself not as a savior of Rome but as its next ruler, driven by ambitions that had been carefully hidden beneath decades of calculated servitude. His betrayal, when it finally came fully into the open, forced Lucius into yet another confrontation, this time against the very man who had trained him, armed him, and shaped him into the fighter capable of surviving everything Rome had thrown at him. The uprising that erupted within the Colosseum spread quickly beyond its walls, as word of the rebellion reached soldiers stationed throughout the city, many of whom had grown just as weary of the emperor's erratic cruelty as Cassius himself. Entire units began to defect, throwing their loyalty behind the conspiracy rather than continuing to serve rulers who had brought Rome to the brink of collapse through neglect and indulgence. Fires broke out in several districts as loyalist forces attempted to suppress the rebellion, and for a period of hours the fate of the entire empire seemed to hang in a delicate and terrifying balance, the outcome uncertain even to those directly shaping the events unfolding in the streets and within the arena itself. The climactic battles that followed were fought not only with swords and shields but with the accumulated weight of every betrayal, every loss, and every hard-won truth that had defined Lucius's journey since the invasion of Numidia. He fought for his mother, for the memory of his wife, for the ideals of a Rome that his grandfather Marcus Aurelius had once tried to build, and for the possibility, however fragile, that the empire might yet be redeemed from the corruption that had consumed it for so many years. Cassius, freed from his execution by the chaos of the uprising, fought alongside Lucius in the final confrontation, the two men who had once been bound by hatred now bound instead by a shared determination to see Rome delivered from tyranny. The emperors Geta and Caracalla, whose erratic and cruel rule had brought Rome to this breaking point, met their own reckoning amid the chaos of the rebellion, their grip on power finally broken by the very spectacle they had so eagerly cultivated for their own amusement. Maximus, whose ambitions had driven so much of the story's final act, was ultimately confronted and defeated by Lucius in a climactic duel that tested every skill he had developed since his arrival in Rome, a battle fought not merely for survival but for the future of the empire itself. The two men circled one another amid the wreckage of the very arena that had brought them together, teacher and student, captor and captive, each fully aware that only one of them would leave the sand alive. Maximus fought with the cunning and improvisation of a man who had survived decades of betrayal and violence through sheer adaptability, while Lucius fought with the accumulated discipline of every lesson Maximus himself had once taught him, a bitter irony neither man failed to recognize even in the heat of combat. When the final blow was finally struck, it carried with it not triumph but a heavy and complicated grief, the recognition that even a man as ruthless and self-serving as Maximus had, in his own twisted way, been shaped by the same brutal empire that had shaped Lucius, two victims of the same corrupt machine who had simply chosen very different paths in response to their suffering. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Rome stood at a crossroads once again, much as it had in the final moments of the original Gladiator decades before. Lucius, having discovered his true heritage, having avenged his wife, having reconciled in whatever painful and incomplete way was possible with his mother Lucilla, and having witnessed firsthand the corrupting influence of unchecked power, was faced with the question of what kind of leader, if any, he wished to become. The film closes on this note of uncertain but hopeful possibility, echoing the themes that made the original Gladiator such a resonant and enduring story, the idea that even amid the ashes of corruption and violence, there remains the possibility of honor, of redemption, and of a better future built not on the whims of tyrants, but on in the quiet aftermath that followed the final battles, as the fires within the city slowly burned themselves out and the people of Rome began the long and uncertain process of rebuilding whatever form of governance might emerge from the wreckage. Lucius found himself standing once more within the Colosseum, this time not as a captive forced to fight for the amusement of a crowd but as a man free, for the first time since the invasion of Numidia, to choose his own path forward. He thought of his wife, of the life they had built together in a small town far from the reach of empire, and he thought of his mother, standing nearby, watching him with an expression that mixed pride, grief, and a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps, after everything, some form of family might still be possible between them. He thought too of Maximus, the man whose story he had grown up hearing in fragments and legends, a man who had died in the same arena believing that his sacrifice might purchase a better future for Rome, only to watch that future slip away in the decades that followed. Lucius understood, standing amid the wreckage of the games that had defined so much of his recent life, that legacies are rarely secured through a single act of heroism, however grand, but must instead be tended and renewed continuously, generation after generation, by those willing to bear the weight of that responsibility. Gladiator II, in its sprawling and ambitious retelling of these events, ultimately positions itself as a meditation on the cyclical nature of power, showing how easily the lessons of one generation can be forgotten by the next, and how the fight for justice, dignity, and honor is rarely won in a single decisive moment but must instead be fought again and again, by different people, in different arenas, across the long and often brutal arc of history. Lucius's journey from a peaceful life in Numidia to the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum and finally to the heart of Rome's political reckoning mirrors, in many ways, the journey of Maximus decades before, a reminder that the strength of an empire is measured not by the grandeur of its monuments, or the brutality of its spectacles but by the courage of those willing to stand against corruption, whatever the cost. The story of Gladiator II is ultimately a story about legacy, about the weight we inherit from those who came before us, and about the choices we make when confronted with the opportunity to either continue the cycles of violence and corruption that have shaped our world or to break from them entirely in pursuit of something nobler. Lucius emerges from his trials not as a simple avenger but as a man transformed by loss, by discovery, and by the painful process of reconciling who he was told he should be with who he ultimately chooses to become. In this way, Gladiator II honors the spirit of its predecessor while carving out its own distinct and deeply human exploration of what it truly means to fight for honor in a world built on spectacle and betrayal. Life Histories of Gladiator II cast. We begin with Paul Mescal, the Irish actor who carries the film as Lucius, the story's grief-stricken and increasingly formidable central figure. Mescal was born on the 2nd of February in the year 1996 in Maynooth, County Kildare, a small town in Ireland known for its university and its quiet, close-knit community life. He was the eldest of 3 children born to Derba Mescal, a police officer with the Irish Garda, and Paul Mescal Sr., a schoolteacher who had also spent time working as a semi-professional actor, planting an early seed of creative possibility within the household. Growing up in Maynooth, young Paul divided his attention between two very different passions, competitive Gaelic football and the performing arts, excelling at both in ways that surprised even those closest to him. He played as a defender for County Kildare's under-21 team and for his local club, and his coach at the time, Cian O'Neill, later described him as remarkably mature for his age and physically strong enough to be considered an exceptional player with real potential in the sport. That athletic path came to an abrupt end when Mescal suffered a broken jaw during a match, an injury serious enough that it forced him to step away from football entirely and redirect his energy fully toward acting, a redirection that would ultimately reshape the course of his life far beyond anything a football career might have offered him. His interest in performance had already been present since his school years, when he took on the title role in a production of Phantom of the Opera, a demanding part for a teenager that hinted at the range he would later become known for. After finishing secondary school, Mescal enrolled at the Lyre Academy, the prestigious drama conservatory housed within Trinity College Dublin, where he trained rigorously in the craft of acting and graduated in 2017. The years immediately following his graduation were filled with steady, unglamorous work in the Dublin theatre scene, including productions such as The Great Gatsby and other stage projects that allowed him to build his skills away from the spotlight. His screen career began modestly in 2019 with a small role in the pilot episode of the television series Bump, but everything changed the following year when he was cast as Conall Waldron in Normal People, the television adaptation of Sally Rooney's acclaimed novel. The role required Mescal to embody a character defined by emotional guardedness, quiet insecurity, and a complicated inner life, qualities he communicated with such subtlety that critics across the world took notice almost immediately. The show became the most streamed series on the BBC that year and a massive success on Hulu internationally, and Mescal's performance earned him the BAFTA Television Award for Best Actor along with a nomination for the Primetime Emmy Award, transforming him overnight from a promising Irish stage actor into an internationally recognized name. In the years that followed, Mescal built a career defined by careful, deliberate choices rather than a rush toward mainstream blockbuster fame. He appeared in The Lost Daughter, God's Creatures, and Carmen, before delivering a performance in Aftersun that many critics consider among the finest of his generation, portraying a young father grappling with depression during a holiday with his daughter. The role earned him his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, cementing his reputation as one of the most gifted actors of his age group working today. He also continued to build a formidable stage career, winning the Laurence Olivier Award for Best Actor for his performance as Stanley Kowalski in a revival of A Streetcar Named Desire at the Almeida Theatre, a production that later transferred to the West End to further acclaim. Mescal has spoken candidly about attending therapy to manage his mental health, describing it as essential to keeping himself grounded amid the pressures of sudden fame, and he has been consistently protective of his private life, expressing frustration at the public's sense of entitlement to details beyond his professional work. Music runs in his family as well, as his sister Nell Mescal has built her own career as a singer, and Paul himself plays piano and has performed alongside her on occasion. His casting as Lucius in Gladiator II was widely reported to have stemmed directly from Ridley Scott's admiration for his work in Normal People, with the director reportedly unable to stop thinking about the young actor's performance after watching the series, ultimately leading to Mescal being handed the responsibility of carrying one of the most anticipated historical epics in recent Hollywood memory. Taking on a role of this scale required an enormous physical transformation, and Mescal underwent months of demanding training to build the strength and combat skill necessary to convincingly portray a gladiator across the film's many brutal arena sequences, a process he has described in interviews as among the most physically punishing preparations of his career to date. Despite the pressures of stepping into a franchise so closely associated with Russell Crowe's Academy Award-winning performance in the original film, Mescal approached the role with the same quiet, internally driven intensity that had defined his earlier work, choosing to focus on Lucius's grief and gradual transformation rather than attempting to simply replicate the tone of his predecessor. In the years since Gladiator II, Mescal has continued to expand his range even further, taking on the role of William Shakespeare in the historical drama Hamlet, based on Maggie O'Farrell's acclaimed novel imagining the playwright's response to the death of his young son, a performance that earned him further awards recognition and reinforced his standing as one of the defining actors of his generation. He has also been reported to be attached to portray Sir Paul McCartney in an upcoming biographical film about the Beatles, a project that speaks to the breadth of ambition now associated with his career trajectory. Throughout his rapid rise, Mescal has remained notably grounded about the nature of fame, telling interviewers that the public's fascination with the personal details of his life, including his highly publicized relationships with musicians Phoebe Bridgers and later Gracie Abrams, often feels disconnected from the actual work he cares about doing. He has described the experience of being recognized constantly in public as something he has had to learn to navigate carefully, preferring to let his performances speak for themselves rather than cultivating a persona through social media, a platform he has largely avoided using since the earliest days of his career. Colleagues and directors who have worked with him consistently describe a work ethic defined by preparation and humility rather than a reliance on natural charisma alone, a reputation that has followed him from his earliest days in Dublin theatre through to his current status as one of the most sought-after leading men of his generation. Standing opposite him as the cunning and magnetic Maximus is Denzel Washington, an actor whose career represents one of the most towering achievements in the history of American cinema. Washington was born on the 28th of December in the year 1954 in Mount Vernon, New York, the middle child of three born to Denzel Washington Sr., an ordained Pentecostal minister within the Church of God in Christ, and Lennis, known as Lynn, who worked as a beautician and ran her own beauty parlor. He began working at the age of 11, sweeping the floors of his mother's shop, and joined the Mount Vernon Boys and Girls Club on his 6th birthday, remaining an active member for the next 12 years, a relationship he has often credited with keeping him away from the drugs, crime, and violence that claimed the paths of many of his childhood friends growing up in a working-class New York suburb. When his parents divorced during his teenage years, his mother made the difficult decision to send him to a private preparatory boarding school in New York, a choice Washington has said instilled in him a discipline that shaped the rest of his life. After high school, Washington enrolled at Fordham University with plans to pursue a career in journalism, but a chance encounter with theater during a summer job as a camp counselor changed his trajectory entirely. Cast in a theatrical production at the camp, he discovered a passion so immediate and consuming that he changed his academic major upon returning to campus that fall, seeking out one of Fordham's leading drama professors to guide his newfound pursuit. He graduated in 1977 with a degree in drama and journalism, and briefly studied at San Francisco's American Conservatory Theater before leaving after a single year to pursue acting work directly. His earliest professional acting came through stage productions, including an important early collaboration with the legendary producer Joseph Papp's Shakespeare in the Park, before he transitioned into television. Washington's film career began to flourish through his collaborations with acclaimed directors tackling stories of historical and social significance. He earned his first Academy Award nomination for playing the anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko in Cry Freedom, and won his first Oscar, for Best Supporting Actor, for his unforgettable performance as a defiant former slave-turned-Union soldier in Glory. His creative partnership with director Spike Lee produced some of the most significant work of his career, culminating in his towering, transformative performance as the civil rights leader Malcolm X in the 1992 film of the same name, a role many critics consider among the greatest screen performances in American film history. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Washington built an almost unmatched run of critically respected and commercially successful films, including Philadelphia, Crimson Tide, The Hurricane, Remember the Titans, and American Gangster, and in 2001 he won his second Academy Award, this time for Best Actor, for his chilling performance as a corrupt police detective in Training Day, becoming only the second black actor in history to win the award in that category, following Sidney Poitier decades earlier. He has since gone on to direct several films himself, including Antoine Fisher and The Great Debaters, and has continued to earn Oscar nominations well into his 60s and 70s for films such as Flight, Fences, and Roman J. Israel Esquire. Washington married actress Pauletta Pearson in 1983, having met her on the set of his very first screen project, and the couple later renewed their vows in South Africa in a ceremony officiated by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Together they have 4 children, John David, Claudia, and twins Olivia and Malcolm, several of whom have gone on to build their own careers within the entertainment industry, including John David Washington's respected work as an actor and Malcolm's emergence as a director. Beyond his work in front of and behind the camera, Washington has long been recognized for his philanthropic commitments, particularly his decades-long relationship with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, an organization he has credited with shaping his own path away from trouble during his childhood in Mount Vernon, and he has served as a national spokesperson for the organization for many years. He has also supported the Fisher House Foundation, which provides housing for the families of military members receiving medical treatment, and has funded scholarships and educational programs reflecting the values instilled in him by his own upbringing in a household that prized discipline, faith, and service. For Gladiator II, Washington's performance as Maximus, a former slave who claws his way into the heights of Roman power through cunning and ruthless ambition, has been singled out by critics and audiences alike as one of the film's defining highlights, adding yet another unforgettable character to an already legendary filmography. Reflecting on the role in interviews conducted around the film's release, Washington spoke of his fascination with Maximus as a man who had turned the trauma of his own enslavement into a lifelong strategy of patience and manipulation, and he approached the character with the same rigorous, research-driven process he has applied throughout his career to real and fictional figures alike. Working once again with director Ridley Scott, with whom he had previously collaborated on American Gangster nearly 2 decades earlier, Washington brought a sense of theatrical relish and dark humor to Maximus that many critics noted stood in vivid contrast to the film's otherwise grim tone, providing some of its most memorable and quotable moments. At an age when many actors of his stature might be expected to slow down, Washington's performance in Gladiator II was widely regarded as a reminder of portraying General Marcus Acacius's Pedro Pascal, an actor whose path to stardom wound through decades of struggle before finally reaching the widespread recognition he enjoys today. Born José Pedro Balmaceda Pascal on the 2nd of April in the year 1975 in Santiago, Chile, he was the son of Veronica Pascal Ureta, a child psychologist, and José Balmaceda Riera, a fertility doctor, and the family's early life was shaped profoundly by the political turmoil of Pinochet-era Chile. Pascal's parents were committed opponents of the military dictatorship, and his mother was connected by family ties to the socialist president Salvador Allende, whose government had been violently overthrown in the coup that brought Pinochet to power. Facing political persecution for their opposition activities, the family fled Chile when Pedro was just 9 months old, moving first briefly through other countries before eventually settling in the United States, where they lived in Orange County, California, and later in San Antonio, Texas. Pascal has spoken warmly of his childhood in Texas, recalling his father taking him and his siblings to the movies every week and to San Antonio Spurs basketball games, ordinary American childhood experiences layered over the extraordinary political backdrop his family had escaped. As a child, he was also a competitive swimmer, winning several awards before eventually setting aside. He attended the Orange County School of the Arts before moving to New York to study at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, graduating with his acting degree in 1997. What followed was nearly 2 decades of persistence through small roles on stage and television, a period during which Pascal has openly admitted he was fired from jobs multiple times and struggled to gain consistent traction in an unforgiving industry. taking on minor guest appearances in television series and small stage roles across New York throughout much of his 20s and early 30s while supporting himself through a variety of other work. He has reflected candidly in later interviews on how disorienting those years of near-constant rejection could be, describing a persistent uncertainty about whether he had made the right decision in pursuing acting at all, even as he continued auditioning and refining his craft with the same discipline he had once applied to competitive swimming as a child. During some of his leanest years, fellow actress Sarah Paulson, a close friend, reportedly shared her own acting pay with him so that he would have enough money to feed himself, a gesture Pascal has spoken about with visible gratitude in interviews reflecting on that difficult period of his career. His breakthrough finally arrived in 2014 when he was cast as Oberyn Martell, the vengeance-driven Dornish prince, in the 4th season of HBO's Game of Thrones, a role that, despite its relatively brief run on the series, made an enormous impression on audiences and critics due to its intensity and the shocking nature of the character's fate. The following year brought further acclaim through Narcos, the Netflix crime drama in which Pascal played Javier Pena, a real-life Drug Enforcement Administration agent who helped lead the hunt for Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar, a performance that ran across 3 seasons and firmly established him as a leading man capable of carrying a prestige television series. Pascal's rise continued through supporting film roles in Kingsman: The Golden Circle, The Equalizer II, and Triple Frontier, before he achieved a new level of global stardom playing the title character in Disney's The Mandalorian, a Star Wars spin-off series in which his face remained hidden behind a helmet for the vast majority of the show's run, requiring him to convey emotion and character purely through voice and physicality. This was followed by an equally significant, and even more emotionally exposed role as Joel Miller in HBO's acclaimed adaptation of the video game The Last of Us, a performance that earned him a Golden Globe Award and an Emmy nomination and further reinforced his growing reputation for portraying complicated, protective father figures, a pattern audiences and critics have often noted across his most beloved roles. Pascal's personal life has also included profound hardship, including the suicide of his mother in 1999, a loss he has described as one that he continues to feel every day even though he does not consider himself a religious person who prays. He has also been a devoted and outspoken supporter of his younger sister, actress Lux Pascal, following her public coming out as a transgender woman in 2021. In Gladiator II, Pascal's portrayal of General Marcus Acacius, a celebrated Roman military leader secretly disillusioned with the empire he serves, added yet another layer of moral complexity to his growing body of work, further building on his reputation as one of the industry's most compelling and versatile leading actors. Preparing for the physically demanding role required Pascal to undergo extensive combat and horseback training, building on the athletic discipline instilled in him during his years as a competitive swimmer. And he has spoken about the particular challenge of portraying a character whose loyalty to Rome is gradually eroded by his growing awareness of the corruption at the heart of the empire he has spent his life defending. Working alongside Paul Mescal, with whom his character shares a complicated and evolving relationship rooted in the tragedy that opens the film, Pascal brought a weariness and moral seriousness to Acacius that critics widely praised as a highlight of the ensemble cast. In the years following Gladiator II, Pascal's career has continued its remarkable upward trajectory, with major roles in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's The Fantastic Four: First Steps, the satirical drama Eddington opposite Joaquin Phoenix, the romantic comedy Materialists, and a return to the Star Wars universe in The Mandalorian and Grogu. Cementing his position as one of the most in-demand leading men in playing Lucilla, the film's central maternal figure and one of the few actors returning from the original Gladiator, is the Danish actress Connie Nielsen. Born Connie Inge-Lise Nielsen on the 3rd of July in the year 1965, she grew up in the small coastal town of Frederikshavn and the nearby village of Elling in Denmark, the daughter of Ben Nielsen, a bus driver, and Leila Inge-Lise Matsegeit, an insurance clerk who also performed in and wrote material for local musical revues. It was through her mother that Nielsen first found her way onto the stage, performing alongside her in local variety shows and political reviews from the age of 15, absorbing early lessons in live performance, satire, and comedic timing that would serve her throughout her career. At 18, driven by ambition and a desire to broaden her horizons, she left Denmark for Paris, working simultaneously as an actress and a model while continuing to study her craft. Her pursuit of formal training eventually carried her to Italy, where she studied at a drama school in Rome and undertook master classes in Milan under Lydia Stix, a respected teacher associated with the Piccolo Teatro di Milano, whom Nielsen has cited as one of the most significant mentors of her early career. She spent many years living and working in Italy, appearing in her feature film debut in the French Jerry Lewis comedy Par Hautes Rentrées in 1984, before gradually building a body of European film and television work throughout the following decade. Nielsen's move toward major English-language stardom came in 1997 when she appeared opposite Al Pacino and Keanu Reeves in The Devil's Advocate, a role that raised her international profile considerably. 3 years later came the role that would define much of her career in the eyes of global audiences, playing Lucilla, the daughter of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius and sister of the tyrannical Commodus, in Ridley Scott's Gladiator. For the role, Nielsen conducted extensive personal research into ancient Rome and frequently served as an unofficial historical consultant on set, helping ensure accuracy in matters of culture and custom throughout the production. Her performance earned her the Empire Award for Best Actress and multiple additional nominations, and the film itself became a global phenomenon, winning 5 Academy Awards including Best Picture. In the years that followed, Nielsen continued building a diverse and internationally minded filmography, appearing in projects such as Mission to Mars, 1 Hour Photo alongside Robin Williams, the French thriller Demon Lover, The Hunted, and Basic. She made her debut in a Danish-language film in 2004 with Brodra, also known as Brothers, a performance that earned her the Danish film industry's Bodil Award for Best Actress along with a Best Actress prize at the San Sebastian International Film Festival. Nielsen has also built a substantial television career, filling in for Mariska Hargitay on Law and Order Special Victims Unit during Hargitay's maternity leave, and later starring in the Starz drama Boss, the Fox thriller series The Following, and the TNT limited series I Am the Night. Beginning in 2017, she took on the role of Queen Hippolyta in the DC Extended Universe, appearing across multiple Wonder Woman and Justice League films. Nielsen is remarkably multilingual, fluent in her native Danish along with English, French, German, Italian, Norwegian, and Swedish, a linguistic range shaped directly by her years studying and working across multiple European countries in her youth. Her return to the role of Lucilla in Gladiator II more than 2 decades after the original film allowed her to bring a matured, deeply emotional dimension to a character now forced to reckon with the son she once sent away to save his life, a performance widely praised as one of the sequel's most quietly powerful elements. Nielsen has spoken openly in interviews about what it meant to revisit a character she had lived with for so many years, describing the experience of returning to the role as an opportunity to explore facets of Lucilla's inner life that the original film, constrained by its own narrative focus on Maximus, had never fully been able to examine. She noted that the intervening decades between the 2 films mirrored her own personal growth as an actress and as a woman, allowing her to bring a hard-won wisdom and emotional depth to Lucilla's scenes with her adult son that would not have been possible earlier in her career. Beyond her acting work, Nielsen has remained an active advocate for humanitarian causes, notably through her involvement with the Human Needs Project, an organization focused on sustainable community development in underserved regions, reflecting a long-standing commitment to social engagement that runs alongside her decades-long career in film and television. Nielsen has often spoken about how her unusual, wide-ranging path through European theater, modeling, and multilingual studies shaped a distinctive approach to acting that she carried into Hollywood, one built less on early formal training in a single national tradition and more on years of practical, hands-on experience gathered across France, Italy, and eventually the United States. That international foundation, she has suggested, gave her an unusual comfort moving between very different kinds of productions, from intimate European art films to large-scale American studio blockbusters, a versatility clearly on display across a filmography that spans the historical grandeur of Gladiator, the psychological unease of one-hour photo, and the portraying the volatile and unpredictable co-emperor Gedda is Joseph Quinn, an Irish-British actor whose rapid ascent to international fame followed years of steady, disciplined work in British theatre and television. Quinn was born on the 26th of January in the year 1994 in Clapham, an area of South London, and has described being drawn to performance from an extraordinarily young age, appearing in school plays as a small child in nursery school. He attended Emmanuel School in Battersea as a drama scholar, a position that reduced his school fees on the condition that he continue participating in the school's theatrical productions, an early formal commitment to acting that shaped much of his adolescence. After completing his secondary education, Quinn pursued rigorous professional training at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, one of Britain's most respected drama conservatories, graduating in 2015 with the technical and classical grounding that would define much of his subsequent stage work. His early professional career unfolded primarily in British television period dramas, including the BBC series Dickensian, in which he played Arthur Havisham, followed by roles in Howard's End and the BBC adaptation of Les Miserables, in which he portrayed the revolutionary student leader in Jaurès. He also appeared briefly in HBO's Game of Thrones as a minor Stark soldier, and continued building a respected stage career, winning the award for Best Actor in a Studio Production at the Manchester Theatre Awards for his performance in the play Wish List, and being named a screen in. Quinn's career reached a decisive turning point in 2022 when he was cast as Eddie Munson, the charismatic leader of the Hellfire Club, in the 4th season of Netflix's global phenomenon Stranger Things. The role, which required him to learn to convincingly perform Metallica's famously difficult guitar solo Master of Puppets for one of the season's most iconic sequences, catapulted him from a relatively unknown British character actor into an instant international star, earning him the Best Breakthrough Performance Award at the MTV Movie and TV Awards and a nomination for the Saturn Award. Following that breakthrough, Quinn moved quickly into major studio productions, starring opposite Lupita Nyong'o in the science fiction horror film A Quiet Place Day 1, before taking on the role of the erratic and cruel co-emperor Gedda in Gladiator II. His momentum has continued to build in the years since, with Quinn taking on the role of Johnny Storm, also known as the Human Torch, in Marvel's The Fantastic Four: First Steps, and later appearing in Alex Garland's war drama Warfare as an American Navy SEAL, further diversifying a filmography that spans horror, historical epic, and superhero blockbuster in remarkably quick succession for a performer who was working in relative obscurity just a few years earlier. For his role as Gedda in Gladiator II, Quinn worked closely with Fred Heckinger, who played his twin brother Caracalla, with the two actors reportedly developing a shared physical and vocal language on set intended to convey the sense that the co-emperors, despite their obvious individual differences, had been shaped by the same corrosive environment of privilege and unchecked power. Quinn has spoken about the particular challenge of playing a character defined largely by cruelty and instability without tipping into pure caricature, describing his approach as rooted in finding the wounded, insecure core beneath Gedda's theatrical displays of dominance. Quinn is also set to take on the role of George Harrison in an ambitious multi-film cinematic project chronicling the story of the Beatles, directed by Sam Mendes, a casting choice that places him alongside Paul Mescal, his own former Gladiator II castmate, in one of the more unexpected overlaps of the modern film industry, as Mescal has been separately linked to portraying Paul McCartney in the same broader Beatles project. Rounding out the central cast as Gedda's twin brother and co-emperor Caracalla is the American actor Fred Heckinger, whose career has been defined by a consistent pattern of collaborating with some of the most respected auteur filmmakers working today. Heckinger was born on the 2nd of December in the year 1999 in New York City, to Sarah Rosen, an accomplished photo director, and Paul Heckinger, who has worked extensively in broadcast and online journalism. His family carries a notable legacy in American media and letters, as his paternal grandfather and namesake was Fred M. Heckinger, a respected education editor for the New York Times who had fled Nazi Germany as a young man in 1936 after being born into a Jewish family in Nuremberg. Growing up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, Heckinger attended St. Anne's School, a well-regarded arts-oriented private school whose alumni also include fellow actors Lucas Hedges and Maya Hawke, placing him within a small but influential circle of young New York performers who would go on to define much of the coming decade's independent and prestige film output. His interest in performance was sparked during his bar mitzvah years, when a family friend brought him to see a show at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater, an experience that left such a strong impression on him that he began pursuing improv and acting immediately afterward. Heckinger's first film role came in a small part in Bo Burnham's acclaimed coming-of-age film 8th Grade, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2018, followed by supporting roles in Vox Lux and Let Them All Talk, working with directors such as Brady Corbett and Steven Soderbergh in his earliest professional credits. His profile rose substantially in 2020 when he starred opposite Tom Hanks in the Western drama News of the World, playing a young man named John Callie in a film Heckinger has described as feeling contemporary despite its post-Civil War setting due to its continued relevance to unresolved questions of land, wealth, and racial justice in America. The year 2021 proved to be a breakout period for Heckinger, in which he appeared as the younger version of a slave catcher character in Amazon's The Underground Railroad, played a teenage serial killer opposite Amy Adams in The Woman in the Window, starred across Netflix's Fear Street horror trilogy, and took on the role of Quinn Mossbatcher, the socially awkward teenage son of a wealthy family. In the first season of HBO's celebrated anthology series The White Lotus, a performance that significantly raised his public profile and industry standing. He continued building his filmography with roles in the miniseries Pam and Tommy, the historical drama The Pale Blue Eye alongside Christian Bale, and later starred in the comedy Thelma and the acclaimed drama Nickel Boys in 2024. The same year he portrayed the unhinged and volatile co-emperor Caracalla in Gladiator II. Heckinger's performance, delivered alongside Joseph Quinn's equally theatrical portrayal of Geta, was singled out by many critics as capturing the exact tone of erratic, spoiled cruelty the film needed to convey the depths to which Roman leadership had fallen since the more principled era of Marcus Aurelius, further establishing Heckinger as one of the most consistently interesting young actors working in American film today. Heckinger has spoken about the particular pleasure of playing a character as openly unhinged as Caracalla, noting in press interviews that the freedom to be theatrical and excessive on screen offered a welcome contrast to the more restrained, internally coiled characters he had often portrayed earlier in his career, such as his quietly troubled teenager in The White Lotus. He has also discussed his approach to historical material more broadly, explaining that he finds particular satisfaction in the research process required for period pieces, treating each new project as an opportunity to learn something substantive about the era being depicted even when the finished film leans towards spectacle rather than strict historical accuracy. Since Gladiator II, Heckinger has continued building a busy and eclectic filmography, taking on roles in projects such as Craven the Hunter, Preparation for the Next Life, and the Josh Safdie-directed Marty Supreme, further demonstrating the same appetite for varied, auteur-driven work that has defined his career since his earliest appearances in Bo Burnham and Barry Jenkins productions. Heckinger's family background in journalism and education has also shaped his own thoughtfulness about the platforms actors are given, and he has spoken candidly in interviews about generational concerns regarding screen time and technology, reflecting a broader intellectual curiosity that colleagues and journalists alike have noted sets him apart from many of his peers in the current generation of young Hollywood talent. Together, this ensemble of actors, ranging from seasoned legends like Denzel Washington and Connie Nielsen to rapidly rising stars like Paul Mescal, Pedro Pascal, Joseph Quinn, and Fred Heckinger, brought a remarkable depth of talent, personal history, and lived experience to the making of Gladiator II. Each of their individual journeys, shaped by vastly different upbringings across Ireland, the United States, Chile, and Denmark, converged in the sands of a fictional Roman arena to bring Gladiator II, the budget, the making, and the funniest moments on set. Welcome back to Review and Facts. Today we are pulling back the curtain on Gladiator II, exploring exactly how much this massive Roman epic actually cost to make, the chaos and challenges that unfolded behind the scenes during its production, and some of the funniest and most surprising stories that came directly from the cast and director during the long and demanding journey of bringing this film to the screen. Let us begin with the numbers, because the story of Gladiator II's budget is nearly as dramatic as the story unfolding on screen. When Paramount Pictures first greenlit the project, the film was budgeted at a comparatively modest $165 million, a substantial figure by any normal standard but a relatively conservative starting point for a film of this scale and ambition. By the time production wrapped, however, reports began circulating that the true cost of the film had ballooned to somewhere in the neighborhood of $310 million, a figure that would place it among the most expensive films ever made, rivaling the budgets typically reserved for the largest superhero team-up movies in the industry. Paramount insiders pushed back against that headline number, insisting that the true net cost of the production, after accounting for various financial offsets, incentives, and accounting adjustments, landed closer to $250 million, with some later reports from sources such as Deadline Hollywood settling on a figure closer to $210 million as the film's actual net budget. Whatever the precise final number turned out to be, there is no question that Gladiator II grew substantially beyond its original financial blueprint, and the reasons behind that growth tell a fascinating story about the scale of ambition Ridley Scott brought to this long-awaited sequel. Understanding the true financial stakes of a production this size requires looking beyond the production budget alone, since marketing and global distribution costs for a film of this scale typically add tens of millions of dollars on top of whatever was spent actually shooting the movie. Industry analysts estimated that when marketing, prints, and distribution costs were factored in alongside the reported production budget, Gladiator II likely needed to gross somewhere between $500 and $600 million worldwide simply to reach a break-even point for Paramount Pictures, a considerably higher bar than the film's box office performance ultimately achieved. When Gladiator II finally opened in theaters, it delivered the biggest opening weekend of Ridley Scott's entire directing career, earning $87 million internationally across 63 territories in the week before its United States release. The film went on to post a strong second weekend as well, pulling in another $106 million worldwide, finishing just behind the animated musical Wicked, which opened the same holiday frame in what entertainment journalists at the time playfully nicknamed the Glicked Weekend, referencing the simultaneous cultural moment created by two very different major releases opening head-to-head. By the end of its theatrical run, Gladiator II had accumulated approximately $462 million in worldwide box office receipts, a genuinely impressive figure for any film, though one that still left the production short of the higher break-even estimates analysts had floated given its reported production costs, meaning that despite strong ticket sales, the film's ultimate profitability for Paramount depended heavily on secondary revenue streams such as home video sales, digital rental income, and streaming licensing fees that would continue accumulating for years after its theatrical release. Part of the reason for the ballooning budget traces directly back to unfinished business from the original film released in the year 2000. During the making of that first Gladiator, Scott had wanted to stage an elaborate battle between a gladiator and a charging rhinoceros, but the idea was ultimately abandoned due to cost and logistical constraints at the time. More than 2 decades later, with a much larger budget and access to significantly more advanced visual effects technology, Scott finally got the opportunity to realize that vision in Gladiator II, and the rhinoceros battle became one of the most expensive and technically demanding sequences in the entire film. Alongside the rhino sequence, the production also committed enormous resources to staging a full-scale naval battle inside a flooded recreation of the Colosseum, complete with functioning combat ships and a pool stocked with menacing sharks circling beneath the surface, a sequence that required specialized hydraulic engineering, massive water tanks, and an enormous amount of coordination between the special effects team and the visual effects artists responsible for enhancing the sequence. Digitally, the original plan for the naval battle sequence actually called for a much heavier reliance on practical, physically filmed water rather than computer-generated effects, but that approach had to be reconsidered and partially reversed once the SAG-AFTRA strike disrupted the production schedule, forcing the visual effects team to take on a larger share of the sequence's water and combat elements than had originally been intended. The ships themselves were built on massive hydraulic rigs capable of pitching and rolling to simulate the chaos of naval combat, surrounded by tanks of water positioned around the perimeter of the enormous Colosseum set that production designer Arthur Max and his team had constructed, allowing the actors performing the sequence to react to genuine physical movement and water spray even as digital sharks and additional flooding effects were later layered into the footage during post-production. The rhinoceros itself, meanwhile, was brought to life through an equally inventive blend of practical engineering and digital artistry. Special effects supervisor Neil Corbould and prosthetics designer Connor O'Sullivan collaborated to construct a mechanical rhino rig capable of being driven around the Colosseum set much like an oversized go-kart, built from a thick, durable plastic material shaped to resemble the animal's hide, complete with a saddle mounted on top so that the stunt performer playing the mounted gladiator would have something physical to sit on and respond to during filming. Because the mechanical rig had no functioning legs of its own, visual effects artists later replaced everything below the saddle with fully computer-generated animation, while retaining the physical bouncing and jostling motion captured on set to give the final digital creature a convincing sense of weight, momentum, and unpredictability. According to the film's visual effects supervisor, this hybrid approach gave the actors performing alongside the rhino genuine physical cues to react to in terms of speed, proximity, and eye lines, even though the finished creature audiences see on screen exists almost entirely as a digital creation layered on top of that practical foundation. The production also had to contend with one of the most disruptive events in recent Hollywood history, the SAG-AFTRA actors' strike that began in the summer of 2023. Filming on Gladiator II had begun in June of that year, but the strike forced a shutdown of production for several months, a stoppage that reportedly cost the production roughly $600,000 per week during the period the cameras were not rolling with union actors, adding up to somewhere around $10 million in additional costs directly attributable to the labor disruption alone. Rather than abandoning the set entirely during the strike, reports suggested that Scott continued shooting certain sequences that did not require the presence of principal union actors, reportedly filming background and crowd scenes using extras within the massive Colosseum set constructed on the island of Malta, allowing the production to keep some momentum going even while its stars were unable to work. When the strike concluded and Washington, Mescal, Pascal, and the rest of the principal cast were able to return, filming resumed in December of 2023 and continued into the early months of the following year, ultimately wrapping after what has been described as a demanding but remarkably efficient 49-day principal shoot given the scale of what was being attempted. Paul Mescal has spoken candidly about the disorienting experience of having production halted so abruptly, recalling that the strike hit the production roughly 5 weeks before principal photography was originally scheduled to wrap. He was not personally on set the specific morning the strike began, but has described hearing from colleagues that other actors were literally sitting in makeup chairs preparing for the day's filming when word came through around 8 in the morning local time that the Colosseum gates were being closed and production was ceasing immediately. Mescal remained in Malta for a few additional days following the announcement, uncertain of what the sudden stoppage would mean for the film's timeline, before eventually returning home to London, where he has said he spent the following weeks anxiously checking entertainment industry trade publications each morning trying to understand how the labor dispute might ultimately be resolved and when, if ever, production might be able to resume. Despite the very real uncertainty and disruption the strike caused for a project he had committed enormous physical and emotional energy toward completing, Mescal has said in later interviews that he has come to feel genuinely glad the strike occurred, expressing strong support for the broader goals of the labor action even while acknowledging how stressful and uncertain that period felt for him personally at the time. Caught between his support for his fellow performers' collective bargaining efforts and his personal investment in seeing the ambitious project he had trained so hard for finally reach completion. Beyond the strike, the production faced its own share of physical challenges and safety concerns typical of a film built around large-scale stunt work and elaborate practical effects. At one point during filming, a stunt sequence went wrong and resulted in several crew members being hospitalized with injuries, reported at the time to include burn injuries sustained during a pyrotechnic or mechanical malfunction, though thankfully none of the injuries were reported as life-threatening and all of the affected crew members were said to be recovering. The production also drew attention and criticism from animal rights organizations, with the group PETA raising concerns about the treatment of horses and other animals used during certain sequences, sending formal letters of concern directly to both Ridley Scott and star Pedro Pascal regarding the welfare of the animals involved in filming. Production representatives strongly disputed these concerns, noting that officials from the Humane Society were present on set throughout filming specifically to monitor and ensure the welfare of any animals involved in the production, and that the animals were neither overworked nor mistreated during the demanding shoot. These controversies added another layer of complexity and public scrutiny to an already demanding production, generating headlines throughout the strike affected months of early production even before a single completed frame of the film had been shown to audiences, though the production ultimately continued and completed filming without any of these issues derailing the project entirely. The filming locations themselves tell their own remarkable story of the scale involved in bringing ancient Rome back to life. Principal photography began with several early sequences filmed in Ouarzazate, Morocco, a location long favored by major film productions for its ability to convincingly stand in for North African desert landscapes, and it was here that the production recreated the Numidian settlement where Lucius begins the story living in quiet exile. Set construction in Morocco began months before cameras started rolling, with crews building out the coastal town that would later be destroyed in the film's opening invasion sequence. From Morocco, the production moved to the island nation of Malta, which served as the primary filming location standing in for ancient Rome itself, much as it had for portions of the original Gladiator film released 24 years earlier. In Malta, production designer Arthur Max, who had also worked on the original film, oversaw the construction of a colossal, largely practical recreation of the Roman Colosseum, a set so massive and convincing that Paul Mescal has said he was genuinely overwhelmed the first time he walked into it. With director Ridley Scott later telling GQ magazine that his young star had practically felt as though he might faint upon first witnessing the sheer scale of what had been built for him to perform. The production's time in Malta proved so significant to the local economy that it received a reported €46.7 million in film incentive rebates from the Maltese government, reportedly setting a record at the time for the largest such rebate ever issued for a film production anywhere within the European Union. A testament to just how much economic activity a production of this size generates in the regions where it chooses to film. Filming also extended to locations within the United Kingdom before the production wrapped in early 2024. Behind the sheer scale of the sets themselves stood an army of craftspeople tasked with recreating the texture and detail of ancient Rome down to the smallest stitch and buckle. Costume designer Janty Yates, who had won an Academy Award for her work on the original Gladiator more than 2 decades earlier, returned for the sequel and once again led an enormous department responsible for outfitting not only the principal cast but also the thousands of background performers required to populate the film's massive crowd and battle sequences. Recreating historically inspired armor, senatorial robes, and gladiatorial gear at this scale required an extensive research process, drawing on surviving Roman artifacts, historical texts, and academic consultation to ensure that even minor background details carried a sense of authenticity, even in moments where the film consciously chose spectacle over strict historical precision elsewhere in the story. Production designer Arthur Max, another key returning collaborator from the original film, has spoken about the particular challenge and thrill of being given the resources to build practical sets at a scale that had simply not been affordable or feasible during the production of the first Gladiator film in the late 1990s. Allowing the team to construct large functioning portions of the Colosseum itself rather than relying as heavily on digital extension work as the original production had been forced to do. It is worth pausing here to note just how much genuine historical research informed even the most seemingly outlandish elements of the film's arena sequences, even when the production ultimately chose spectacle over strict accuracy. Classical studies experts consulted on the film's press materials have noted that Roman arena spectacles genuinely did feature an enormous range of exotic animals imported from across the known world, including elephants, ostriches, bears, bulls, lions, leopards, tigers, and panthers, all part of a competitive culture in which each successive emperor felt pressure to outdo his predecessor by staging ever stranger and more elaborate displays for the Roman public. Rhinoceroses were indeed a genuine and celebrated part of that historical tradition, appearing as prized attractions within actual Roman arena spectacles, though historians have noted that there is no credible evidence to suggest any gladiator ever actually rode one into combat the way Lucius does in the film. Since these animals represented enormously valuable and difficult to acquire assets that the Roman authorities would have had little practical incentive to expose to unnecessary risk. Naval battles staged within flooded arenas similarly have a basis in documented Roman history, complete with accounts of predatory sea creatures such as moray eels being introduced into the water to heighten the danger and spectacle, though the specific inclusion of sharks in Gladiator II represents a deliberate and openly acknowledged creative embellishment on Scott's part rather than a literal historical claim. One the director has cheerfully admitted was simply too compelling a piece of showmanship to resist including in the finished film. Now let us turn to some of the most memorable and genuinely funny stories that emerged from the making of this enormous and often grueling production, beginning with the now legendary tale of the Gladiator II baboons. Ridley Scott has told the story of where the idea for the film's ferocious baboon attack sequence originated on multiple occasions, and it traces back to a moment he witnessed years earlier while filming on location in South Africa for an entirely different project. Scott has described being at a safari-style park filled with wandering wildlife, the kind of place where visitors casually park their cars while sipping coffee, when he witnessed a group of baboons sitting along a wall watching the tourists pass by. According to Scott, one particularly unwise visitor decided to approach one of the larger baboons and attempt to pet it, an act of confidence that was almost immediately and violently punished, with the baboon attacking the man so ferociously that he dropped his coffee entirely and sprinted for the safety of his car while being clawed the entire way. Scott has said he found the entire incident absolutely hilarious to witness from a safe distance, but beyond the comedy of the moment, he was struck by the sheer physical intensity and unpredictability of the animal's defensive aggression, filing the memory away until years later when he needed a suitably terrifying obstacle for Lucius to face early in his gladiatorial career. To bring the baboon attack sequence to life, Scott and his visual effects team, led by ILM supervisor Mark Bukowski, developed an unusual and genuinely amusing production method. Rather than relying purely on computer-generated creatures from the very beginning, Scott cast 12 unusually small stuntmen, some of them tough teenagers and others simply diminutive adult performers, and dressed them all in black motion capture tights. In a detail that has delighted fans and journalists alike whenever it comes up in interviews, Scott revealed that he personally had tiny painted whiskers added to the stuntmen's faces purely for his own amusement during filming, despite the fact that these whiskers would never actually appear in the finished film once the digital baboon models were layered on top of the performers. The result of this unusual process was, in Scott's own words, something resembling a stuntman brawl of pure savagery, as these 12 small but incredibly athletic performers wrestled and grappled with Paul Mescal and his fellow Gladiator actors on set, providing the raw physical performance data that visual effects artists would later use as the foundation for the fully rendered digital baboons audiences see in the finished film. Scott even shared a particularly amusing note he gave directly to Mescal during filming of the sequence, encouraging his star to bite one of the baboon's stand-ins during their struggle so that the creature would appear psychologically shocked and recoil, a moment Scott has described as intentionally meant to land as darkly comedic amid the brutality of the scene. The design of the lead baboon itself became something of a running joke during the film's press tour, as Scott revealed that he had modeled the creature's unusual, almost hairless appearance on a baboon he had observed suffering from alopecia, a condition that causes total hair loss, during that same formative visit to the South African Wildlife Park years earlier. Scott has recounted with obvious amusement how, upon the film's release, at least one confused viewer approached him to comment that they had never seen a baboon looking quite like the one depicted in the movie, prompting Scott to explain, in characteristically blunt and colorful language, exactly what alopecia is and why he had deliberately chosen to give his villainous baboon that particular striking and unsettling appearance, describing the resulting creature as looking like pure sinew and tendon with absolutely no fat, comparing its physique to muscular steel. Mescal has spoken about the enormous pressure that came with stepping into a franchise so closely associated with Russell Crowe's Oscar-winning performance in the original film, and Washington himself has openly acknowledged just how daunting that challenge must have felt, telling interviewers with a laugh that Mescal was coming into the role behind Russell Crowe, and somehow managed to pull the whole thing off. Mescal has also discussed his own instinct to protect himself emotionally from being overwhelmed by the experience of working alongside a performer he had admired since childhood, explaining that he made a conscious decision early on to allow himself to feel genuine admiration for Washington as an actor while still finding a way to treat him, in the practical moment-to-moment reality of performing a scene together, as he would treat any other colleague, a mental discipline he has credited with allowing the two of them to settle into a natural creative partnership rather than being paralyzed by starstruck nerves throughout the entire shoot. Just as memorable as the baboon's story is the account of how Paul Mescal first worked up the courage to formally introduce himself to his legendary co-star Denzel Washington. Mescal has told this story on multiple occasions in interviews, including a particularly charming retelling during an appearance on The Graham Norton Show alongside Washington himself, and each retelling captures the same disarming mixture of starstruck anxiety and self-deprecating humor that has become one of Mescal's most endearing qualities in interviews. According to Mescal, the first day the two actors were scheduled to actually share the set together, Mescal found himself positioned up in an elevated section of the set while Washington observed from a box above, and Mescal spent the entire day performing an intense physical sequence involving fighting the film's baboon creatures rather than sharing any actual scene time with his co-star. At the end of that long day of filming, Mescal resolved that he absolutely needed to go and formally introduce himself to Washington, given that the two had not yet properly met despite being cast opposite one another in one of the year's biggest films. Rather than following through immediately, however, Mescal has admitted that his nerves got the better of him in the moment, and he found himself retreating instead, effectively running back to his own dressing room rather than working up the courage to approach the two-time Academy Award winner. The actual introduction finally happened the following day, and Mescal has described waiting nervously at the bottom of a staircase, having decided that he would simply stay put and let the meeting happen naturally rather than seeking Washington out directly. When Washington did eventually walk down those stairs, Mescal recalled the moment with visible warmth, describing how Washington extended his hand, introduced himself simply and without any pretension, and left Mescal feeling as though he had just experienced something extraordinary despite how ordinary the exchange itself might have looked to any outside observer. True to the reputation for humor that colleagues frequently attribute to him, Washington did not let the moment pass without a bit of gentle teasing, looking Mescal up and down for what felt like an uncomfortably long stretch of time before delivering the now widely quoted line, telling his younger co-star to stop working out so much. A comment referencing the intense physical transformation Mescal had undergone to prepare for the physically demanding role of Lucius. Mescal has spoken about that rigorous preparation process himself in numerous interviews, describing a training regimen built around what he has jokingly referred to as endless chicken breasts and heavy lifting of things, a process he ultimately described as genuinely enjoyable despite its demands, in contrast to fellow actor Eddie Redmayne, who once commented in a separate conversation alongside Mescal that his own experiences bulking up for film roles had felt far closer to horrendous than fun. Beyond that initial meeting, Mescal and Washington reportedly developed what both actors have separately described as a very easy and natural working relationship as filming progressed in Malta. During stretches of the shoot when the rest of the principal cast were occupied elsewhere, Mescal has described having Washington essentially all to himself for a period of a couple of weeks, using the downtime between takes to pull up a chair and talk with Washington at length about Shakespeare and classic stage plays. A shared passion between the two actors given Washington's extensive theatrical background and Mescal's own roots in Dublin and London theatre. In one particularly memorable exchange, Mescal has said he directly encouraged Washington to consider returning to the stage to perform in a production of Othello, asking Washington whether he had ever played the role before. When Washington confirmed that he had indeed performed the part previously, Mescal simply responded that he should do it again, a small piece of encouragement that Washington has since credited, at least in part, with his decision to take on the role of Othello in a major Broadway production alongside actor Jake Gyllenhaal as Iago. A delightful example of how the bonds formed on a demanding film set occasionally ripple outward into entirely separate corners of the entertainment industry. Mescal has also shared a particularly funny and slightly intimidating story about his very first encounter with director Ridley Scott on the opening day of filming. According to Mescal, he found himself sitting nervously inside the production tent when Scott walked in smoking a cigar, looked directly at him, and asked bluntly whether he was nervous. Unsure of how to respond appropriately to a director of Scott's stature and reputation, Mescal has said he simply offered a non-committal sound rather than a real answer, at which point Scott reportedly told him flatly that his nerves were no use to him whatsoever before immediately marching off set and calling for the cameras to start rolling, leaving Mescal to simply push through the moment and begin performing. Mescal has recounted this story with obvious fondness rather than resentment, framing it as an early lesson in Scott's famously brisk, no-nonsense approach to directing, an approach that Mescal and his fellow cast members have generally described as remarkably efficient and confidence-inspiring once they adjusted to Scott's blunt communication style. Washington, for his part, has offered his own share of memorable and often very funny commentary about his character Maximus throughout the film's press tour. During one public question-and-answer session attended by Mescal, Connie Nielsen, and Fred Heckinger, Washington offered a characteristically dry and comedic defense of his villainous character, joking to the audience that Maximus was simply misunderstood, describing him with mock sincerity as a nice fellow who happened to be willing to use absolutely everyone around him, including his own mother and his own children, adding with a laugh that Maximus had already used up his own soul so thoroughly that he had none left to spare, before concluding that his character was, in his own colorful phrasing, essentially in bed with the devil. Washington has also spoken about the physically demanding underwater sequences required for the film's climactic confrontation, waving off any suggestion that the water-based fight choreography presented any real difficulty for him personally, telling interviewers with characteristic confidence that he was perfectly capable of fighting whether wet or dry. A response that drew laughter from casts and journalists alike given the sheer physical intensity of the sequence being described. Joseph Quinn and Fred Heckinger, who played the volatile and theatrical twin emperors Geta and Caracalla, have also spoken with visible delight about developing their characters' shared unhinged energy together during filming, with Quinn joking in one interview that he did not need to dig particularly deep within his own soul to access the mania and petulance required for the role. A self-deprecating joke that speaks to the playful camaraderie that developed among the film's ensemble cast. Throughout the demanding shoot, the two actors reportedly spent considerable time together off-camera during the Malta shoot developing a shared physical and vocal shorthand for their characters, working to ensure that the twin emperors, despite behaving quite differently from one another in individual scenes, still felt as though they had been shaped by the exact same environment of unchecked privilege and imperial excess. Journalists covering the film's press tour repeatedly noted the easy chemistry between the two actors during joint interviews, describing an almost sibling-like rapport that seemed to have grown organically out of the many weeks the pair spent filming scenes together and matching elaborately theatrical costuming designed to visually reinforce their status as two halves of the same corrupted whole. Both actors have also spoken about the particular freedom that came with playing characters allowed to be so openly excessive and cruel, describing it as a welcome contrast to the more restrained or grounded roles each had built earlier reputations playing, with Heckinger in particular noting that the sheer theatricality of Caracalla offered him a chance to work in a register quite different from the quieter, more internalized characters he had often portrayed in prestige television and independent film. Meanwhile, Paul Mescal has also discussed the considerable effort involved in negotiating with Ridley Scott to be allowed to perform certain stunts himself rather than relying entirely on stunt doubles, including a particularly striking sequence near the film's climax in which Lucius leaps onto a moving horse in a single fluid motion while in pursuit of Maximus. Mescal has described how much he wanted to earn Scott's trust to perform the stunt himself rather than cutting away to a double, understanding that a visible, unbroken shot of the actual actor pulling off the mount would carry far more impact for audiences than a cleverly disguised substitution. According to accounts from the production, Mescal reportedly had something of a friendly wager riding on his ability to successfully pull off the stunt himself, joking that the outcome of the bet involved the value of 2 Bentley automobiles.